This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
A man who, in my estimation, is well ahead of Mary MacKillop for canonisation in Australian circles, although perhaps not via Rome. We're here to discuss this wonderful tome, Hitch 22. Christopher, may I call you Chris?
No.
Thank you, right?
No, you may not. I promised my mother no circumcision of the name, no amputation. That's of the first name.
Right, okay, all right. Well,
I've amputated the second one.
Fair enough too. Well, we'll stick with Christopher then. You've taken on many large and imposing subjects. Henry Kissinger, a woman called Therese or something, I forget her name, and God. But you've taken on something a tad more substantial now, yourself. I thought I'd ask you
This time it's personal.
The first memoir that's actually a sequel. I thought I'd begin by asking, how did you find the experience of writing a memoir as opposed to your usual kind of excoriating grace on other subjects?
Sweet of you to put it like that. Well, tough, because normally I'm making a case, laying one down, trying to be an advocate, trying to explain, trying to marshal evidence and so on. In your own case, you aren't doing that, or I'm not anyway. It's not an apologia. Second, I've normally been trying to see how much I could cram into a given number of words and how economically or tersely I could do it. And with memory, you keep finding, and mine's alarmingly good, you keep finding you recollect more, and you want to get it down while you can, so it balloons out a bit in bags. I gave the publishers much more than they asked for. And then, obviously, I suppose, but it wasn't obvious to me before, you don't know how it ends. So it was very useful to me that the National Portrait Gallery in London published a catalogue of pictures of a group of people who I used to be associated, well, still am associated with, in which I was referred to as the late. Because nothing concentrates the mind more than reading about yourself in the past bloody tense. And it was at that point I thought, well, now I have an answer to the argument, isn't it a bit early? Well, you can't do it too late, can you?
Well, certainly you don't have the option of a prequel, having begun where you did, but perhaps a sequel on its way. How did you define the task of writing your memoirs? Did you rule things in and out at the outset? Or,
yeah.
And what did you rule out and why?
Out first. Anything about people who'd indulged me in any way at all, unless they were dead, or public figures and were asking for it. Because you can't do that fairly unless the book is only about those I loved, which it isn't. So I have no copyright on anyone but myself. That was one. Second, on the whole, only to try and write about myself when I was with people or in places that are otherwise intrinsically interesting. So that avoid being boring and try and locate myself in places and times or with people who might attract interest in it on their own, for their own sake. And
what did you find the easiest part of the memoir to write, and what the most difficult?
Can I do that in reverse order?
You may.
The most difficult was about my beloved Mama. So I decided to write that first, about her being taken away from me early and by her own hand in a suicide pact with a lover, an unsuitable lover. And I thought I'd been wondering all my life if I could, this was a long time ago, 1973, whether I could ever or would ever want to write about that. I thought, well, I can't not, so now I'll find out. And I wrote that in one go, and then read it through, and then I wept, to my own surprise, quite a lot. But then I thought, but I hope no one else weeps about it. I don't want it to be a tearjerker. I don't want it to be sentimental. And I sent it to the publisher and said, if you like this, then I think we can do it. And if you don't like it, I don't want to do it anymore.
Indeed, yeah.
And they were quite nice. They said, if you carry on like that, it should be okay.
And it is, I mean, it's an amazing scene, the way you describe first laying eyes on the Parthenon from a unique location.
Yes, well, my mother's deathbed was a crime scene. That was a horrifying moment because, as I was told about it on the radio and read about it in the newspaper before I got to Athens, she'd been murdered by her lover, and that's what I arrived there thinking.
A man you'd met?
A man I'd met, and she wanted me to approve of, and I sort of did. I didn't disapprove. He was a gamey guy. My father, I should add, was a very honest and very decent and very upright and thrifty and reliable man. But he bored my mother, and the boyfriend wasn't honest or upright or thrifty or righteous, but he was amusing. He was a spoiled priest of the Church of England. He had once been vicar of St. Martin's in the Fields. He was slightly poetic. He was a bit tubercular. He had the ingredients of romance, but bipolar probably, and depressive. Probably a bad catch. Anyway, but she desperately wanted me to like him. So I sort of gave her my approval. She needed my approval. But I didn't disbelieve that he might have killed her, actually. I thought it was possible. Anyway, once I got to this terrible hotel room in the middle of Athens and realized with this incredibly grisly sight that it hadn't been a murder, it had been a suicide agreement.
And what made you realize that?
Well, a letter she left, some photographs the police showed me that I had to look at, all kinds of stuff. What am I saying? All kinds of stuff. I mean, some very harrowing and wrenching and lacerating material. And also the terrible stench of death, because they hadn't been discovered for a little while. I went to the window. I just couldn't stand it anymore. Threw the window open, and suddenly there, on the hill of the Acropolis, was the Parthenon, as if I was seeing it for the very first time. Well, I was seeing it for the very first time, but as if I'd clocked it for the very first time. And in my book I say, well, the first memory I have of my mother is Mediterranean light. I was crossing the Grand Harbour at Valletta. Some of you may have been there, one of the great Baroque and Renaissance cities of Europe, where Caravaggio did some of his naughtiest painting. And my first memory of her is this flash of blue, green, and white of a lovely Baroque and Renaissance city coming down to the harbour, meeting the green and blue of the sea and the sky. A flash, that's my first memory. A lovely way to have a first memory, and I'm holding her hand. And then this other amazing flash of Greek Attic light, but seen from a death chamber. So those are the bookends of my memories of Yvonne, as I call her, because it was her name.
But there's a certain distance in that terminology, isn't there? How did you describe her when you spoke to her? Did you call her mum or mummy? Or?
No, I would call her Yvonne because she liked it. If you're a Navy wife, as she was, my father was a naval officer, but most of my ancestors, male ancestors, are naval and military. The Navy wife would be called Ethel or Marjorie or Joan. I don't know if you're getting a picture. Sterling women all, and representing the British Empire overseas in various bases. And so Yvonne, kind of stylish name by comparison, and she had a bit of class and character, very beautiful, was very well dressed, never embarrassed me at school speech days by wearing the wrong hat or anything like that. She's lovely, and so, and it was a Frenchified name, and I knew she liked it if I called her Yvonne, so I always did.
You refer to your father in the book as the commander. Is that how you spoke to him as well? Or?
Well, that's what the family called him.
Really?
Yeah, rather depressed, rather pessimistic, rather taciturn chap. Yeah, and he'd risen through the ranks to become a commander, and then they let him go after the war. He hadn't got the next level of promotion. He never forgave the Navy after having been in a very arduous war against the Nazis, running guns to Stalin across the Arctic Circle. Not what he'd signed up with His Majesty's forces to do, is to run guns to the communists, but it was his duty, so he did it. Very brave, had a horrible time. They let him go at the end of the war, and then they put up the pensions for people who joined later. He never forgave them for it. But it was the big thing in his life that he'd been in the Navy, so we would call him, partly respectfully and partly affectionately, the commander. And I remember one day I thought, I'm not a great one for breakfast or early mornings. My father was an early morning guy. He'd go down and make breakfast in the kitchen for himself. My mum liked to lie in as well. I thought, maybe I should just go down and have breakfast with him. I should have put this in the book. And I'm his firstborn, you know, we don't hang out much, and maybe he'd like it if I just came and said, you know, I came down, morning, he looked up, he said, bloody hell, it'll be family prayers next. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that. You don't have to tell me twice.
So did writing about your father and mother change the way you think of them or feel about them?
No, I mean, it didn't, because they've been gone for a long time and I've had a lot of time to inwardly digest all that. But there is another question that came up in my life long after my mother was gone, and as my father was dying. My mother's mother, if you follow me closely here, who lived to be nearly 100, as did my grandfather, realized there was no further purpose in keeping a family secret, which was that my mother had Jewish parentage and had not wanted me to know, and had not wanted anyone else to know either. So just as I'm going through that experience that Yeats says is the crucial one of losing your father, Granny arrives and says to my brother and to myself, I've got something to tell you. And it was a rather vertiginous moment. And so I have had to interrogate things again in retrospect. Why did she never tell me? Was she ever going to? What was her motive for keeping it quiet? I think I can now guess.
And how do you do that?
Well, I think that for one thing, she could pass. She didn't, as they say, look Jewish, which now I realize that my grandmother rather did. She and her mother had had a slightly hard time in the millinery business in the 30s, in the 40s. England is not a country that's disfigured by any bad record of anti-Semitism, but there's low-level stuff. You know, people would say things like, oh, they've got lots of time to spend on Sundays, or if a Mr. Rubinstein was made, oh, very fine old Anglo-Saxon name. As the man in the Chariots of Fire says, Harold Abrams, you catch it on the edge of a remark. Nothing horrible, but a little bit of edge there. And I think she was absolutely determined that her children wouldn't suffer from this, and that Christopher Eric Hitchens, the firstborn, would become an English gentleman. So you be the judge of how well that worked out.
Well, I must say, as an American, you do a very good impersonation of an English gentleman.
Well, you do say the sweetest things. Yvonne would have been, actually, she would have been very happy to hear that. She would have felt it had been all worthwhile, because she had to sacrifice a lot to get me to school and things like that. And she would still be asking, as would the commander, this is all very well, but when are you going to get a proper job?
And you describe in the book the journey that you went on having discovered this information.
Yeah.
And I was curious, did you go on that journey as a journalist or as a relative?
Well, I went to, if you mean to Poland.
Yes.
Yeah. My mother's ancestors came from what is now Poland, but was when they lived there, Germany. As you all know, there's been a lot of trouble every time that border has moved. It's a very worrying area of Europe, and a lot of terrible things have happened there and are still buried there. And they'd left in good time, actually. I think they saw it coming. So half of my life has been spent writing about matters arising from the movements of that border. How much it cost to change the name of the city of Breslau to Wrocław. In any case, I mean, anyone who's taken any interest in the life and times and authorship of the 20th century is already invested in that, whether they're Jewish or Polish or German or not. So it wasn't just a roots trip, no. But it was that as well.
Right, yeah. Did the personal nature of the engagement change the way you experienced it?
Well, if you go to Breslau, you'll find that, well, Edith Stein is from there, for example, the Jewish woman who became a nun and was sent to Auschwitz. Max Born is from there, the man to whom Einstein wrote the letter saying God doesn't play dice with the universe. The man who invented Zyklon B poison gas is from there. It's an extraordinary place. It was the setting for the midnight of the century, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And it was the last city in Germany to surrender after Berlin. They held out so long there was hardly one brick piled on another. And then after the mass murder after the Judeo-side, the Shoah Holocaust, there was then a mass expulsion of Germans from there as well, which conditioned the building of the Berlin Wall. So I almost felt trivial. This is a whole chapter in my book, but I almost felt trivial intruding my own family history into it. But I wanted to know why Mr. Blumenthal, my ancestor, had left that small town, Kempno, when he did. And I wanted to find out what the context was and to see what had happened to those he'd left behind.
So you talk about making this discovery and, of course, becoming an American as well. How do you identify yourself now?
Anglo-American. I mean, I didn't move to the United States till I was about 30, so it would be silly to say I'd left everything behind. I mean, if I just went around saying I was an American, people would think it was incongruous.
There's not much of a twang in the accent.
Not a lot, no. I speak American now. I mean, for example, I say I'm going to the store rather than to the shop. And if I'm at the shop, I say, do you have, not have you got. And I avoid the word schedule altogether, because I can never remember now which one it is. And stuff like that. And I don't like hyphenation. I think Americans should identify as Americans, but the fact is there are people who say they're Polish American, Greek American, Arab American, and so on. Oddly enough, the Jews do it the other way around. It's the American Jewish Committee. Or the American Jewish Congress, not the Jewish American one. I've never quite been able to work out what that is. But Anglo-American is a literature. I mean, Henry James was an Anglo-American. W.H. Auden was an Anglo-American. T.S. Eliot was an Anglo-American. It's a subject. It's
not a bad club.
It's a culture. It's not bad. I make my students at NYU, New School, New York, answer this question. W.H. Auden left England and became, if not exactly an American, certainly a New Yorker. And T.S. Eliot left St. Louis and became a high Anglican, an Anglo-Catholic, and someone who was almost tried to be more English than the English. Which culture got the best of this exchange? It's Auden, by the way. So I think one can decently do that without any reservations. And when I had to take my oath, which I did on Thomas Jefferson's birthday, which is also mine, at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and they said, well, do you forswear allegiance to any foreign princes? And I had a sudden picture of Prince Charles.
He'd gone sometime earlier.
A sort of bat-eared, Islam-fancying, no taste in girls.
Not much pause there.
Resentful, balding, jug-eared, who will, when his mother dies, become, at that instant, head of the Church of England, head of the state, and head of the armed forces. That's what you get if you found a church on the family values of Henry VIII. I could see myself saying, no, I forswear allegiance to any foreign princes. That prince I can, without that prince I can do. Good night, sweet prince.
You write at one point that there is, I think what you describe as a sweet law, that the person who should be scrutinising your work almost inevitably does.
Yeah.
Who's that for this book?
Well, in this case, I once wrote a piece not long after I made my discovery of the family secret about my Jewish self, and it was called On Not Knowing the Half of It. And it was published in an incredibly obscure magazine in New York, Literary Quarterly, edited by a guy called Ben Sonnenberg. Probably a circulation of about 2,000 people. And then it did get reprinted. Actually, it won a prize. It was chosen for the best American essays of that year. So it was promoted to a slightly more widely circulated book, probably 10,000 readers. And then it got picked up here and there. And eventually, I knew it would happen, someone wrote to me and said, "I'm your mother's cousin." It's bred on the waters. It's bound to happen. And I know exactly where Nathan Blumenthal came from, and I can give you directions to the old town in Poland. It took a long time. It's the same if you decide to use the word clitoris or something in an article. You think, my Aunt Grace in Tasmania will never see this piece. She's just
and
not...
the one day...
I can safely say clitoris, she's never going to see it. And then at Christmas...
That's what Aunt Grace searched to find the article.
At Christmas, a letter arrives, and it's Aunt Grace from Tasmania, and she encloses a teddy bear because she's forgotten how old you are and so on. She said, I do try and follow your career, dear, and I understand that I'm so thrilled that you're a writer, but someone sent me the most extraordinary article the other day where you used this word that I couldn't believe you were doing it. Ah, right. No, you realize all your life is lived in public. Yeah.
Well, I asked you earlier about the hardest bit of the memoir to write. We didn't quite get round to the easiest or the most fun. What was that?
Oh, the easiest is the chapter about Martin Amis, who is the only blonde I've ever really loved, or loved passionately and for a long time, and who's been a huge influence on me and is my best and my dearest friend, and who I didn't think of putting it quite like this when I wrote the chapter, but what it really is an answer to the question, or an attempted answer to the question, can you have a heterosexual relationship with a chap? And my answer to this is probably not, but I'm willing to give it the old college try.
And indeed, you've given many things the college try.
It's a love letter chat. Yeah, the old college try has been a feature. Yes. Where you? Oh no, I see. Yeah. Well, go on then.
Well, no, you go on.
No, you're the boss.
Well, no, I mean, I was interested in that. I mean, you talk with unusual candour about your homosexual sexual experiences, but then you talk about your friendship with Martin in a very different register. Are they entirely separate things?
Yeah. I mean, the gay moments in my life were all when I was very young, and when, as it were, if you were looking for an excuse, it would be, well, there aren't any girls around here anyway. They've locked us up in a monastic school, and what do they fucking expect?
Well, that's what they expect. Yeah,
that's what they expect. Whether they expect it or not, that's what they got. But the emotions could be involved as well.
Well, that's right, and you do talk about those experiences being experiences of love as well.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, the other reason I decided to include all this was, I live in a country where every now and then, and actually quite strongly at the present time, there are attempts to have homosexuality defined as a disease or a disorder. And not only in the United States, but by the Catholic Church and others. And I thought, well, I think as a minor gesture of solidarity, I might as well say what 90% of male heterosexuals know, which is that gay experience is not unknown to them. And that, furthermore, that homosexuality is a form of love, not just a form of sex, and demands respect and, if you want, protection on those grounds alone. So, to the extent I can contribute to that recognition, I ought to probably do so.
No, right.
God, you wouldn't have thought there were so many bum baggers in an Australian audience. I thought mateship in Oz was strictly platonic.
We don't do Plato here. But to Martin, that's a very different...
No, well, with Martin, the subject we had in common was very intense, very deep-going, very ruthless scrutiny of the woman question, as viewed from every conceivable angle. This never over, the subject absolutely never over, and always ready to resume it, and fascination with it.
Although it's not something you write about much.
Well, no, because again, I don't have copyright in those ladies. More's the pity.
And one of the things that really comes across in your friendship with Martin, but also many other people, is the tremendous fun you have. You seem to be quite good at fun, and in particular wordplay. What's your favourite word game?
I was very lucky with Martin and others in the late 70s. We had a sort of lunch club every Friday in somewhere roughly between Bloomsbury, Soho and Fleet Street, that world, where we'd all meet with Clive James. And I should say, I almost feel like pausing for a second in memory, the late Peter Porter, one of Australia's most beautiful and brilliant exports to, if he was an export, I think he always felt Australian, to England, and one of the great contributors to English poetry and poetry criticism, and Terry Kilmartin, the translator of Proust, who was the books editor of The Observer, and a few others. And yeah, we would try and improvise word games. Do you want the inexpensive one? Because it had to start low and then build.
Start medium, but let's get to the high bits.
If you change the word heart in any common poem, title or song, to the word dick.
Total eclipse of the dick.
Sounds cheemed at total eclipse of the dick.
Yeah.
I left my dick in San Francisco. Don't go breaking my dick.
Dick Break Hotel?
No, down at the end of Lonely Street in Dick Break Hotel. Yeah. That's when your dick aches begin. The dick is a lonely hunter. So I can do this for quite a long time.
Yes.
But we did the hard thinking about heart dick. Then you see, you play this, it's quite puerile, you'll agree. It's pathetic to be laughing at this kind of thing. But then one day, Woody Allen is interviewed about running off with his adopted daughter and setting up house with her. And he says, well, the heart wants what it wants. Makes it all worthwhile. So then things would improve a little bit, and say the greatest player of all these games, and the man who really raised the whole level, about whom I have a whole chapter in. But by the way, the book is called Hitch 22, and it's published by Allen and Unwin. Available at fine bookstore.
Yeah.
I can sell it to you afterwards. The whole chapter about Salman Rushdie, who is a genius at this kind of thing. And with Salman one day, it was a dinner, and someone arrived late, having been delayed on a flight. And he said, I had a terrible time being delayed on this plane. And not only was it a bore being delayed, but there was nothing to read at the airport bookstore except Robert Ludlum stuff. And he said, I had to buy one. And I knew it would be bad, but I had no idea how bad it would be. And that didn't seem very controversial or interesting. So he went on about it, though, and said, it's the titles, these crap titles like, I don't know, the Eiger sanction, or you know how it goes. They're so bad I can't even remember them, but you know what I'm talking about. And then, by good chance, someone said, well, what would a Shakespeare play be like if Robert Ludlum had written it? And Salman looked up like that, said, okay. And I said, all right, well, what would Hamlet be? And he said, the Elsinore vacillation. With no more time than I gave you. And I said, well, all right, but you can't do that twice. What about Macbeth? He said, the Dunsinane reforestation. And
So he could go on that as well.
We went on through the kerchief implication, the Rialto sanction. He's a genius. And he then invented one all of his own, which was the titles of books that didn't quite make it. Nice Try, The Big Gatsby, Good Expectations. Let me think. For Whom the Bell Rings. Mr. Zhivago. And I think I contributed at this point Portrait of a Woman, which I was. But then he said, this I think is almost the best, 2 days in the life of Ivan Denisovich. He can just do that, okay? But what people want, I find, is filth, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so why don't you change the word love to fuck and see what happens there?
And you're not bad at rhyming your filth either. You've spoken, well, you've written about feeling some limitations as a writer compared to your august friends. And I might get you to comment a bit more seriously on that later.
No, I should do that now.
Okay, well, I'll do it now then.
Well, it was very useful to me working at the New Statesman, which was then a pretty good politico-literary magazine in London, with some prestige to it, with Martin and with James Fenton, who I still think is the best poet writing in English, and Ian McEwan and others, Julian Barnes, all on the staff or on the contributing periphery. It was very handy for me because just by talking to them, listening to them, I learned a lot about writing by osmosis almost. But I also realized that people who can do fiction and poetry have an ingredient of stuff that I don't have. And so I thought, my little ambitions for the bottom drawer, that slim volume, I think I'm not going to waste the public's time with that. I'll concentrate on the essay form. There I think I might contribute something. And I've since then evolved a theory of a sort that those who have poetic and fictional capacity, which I don't possess, have musical ability, which is another thing I don't have. When confronted with musical notation, I feel dyslexic almost. I just don't have it. And I've been told by some critics and professors of literature much senior to myself that I may well be onto something with this. But if you think about it, I mean, Shakespeare is practically a musician. He's full of music. So is Chaucer. The Romantic poets are a lot of the Russians. Nabokov didn't like music, but he understood it. Dickens was a musician. I'm going to press this on, and Ian McEwan could write a review of a concert, whether it was jazz or classical, easily. Several of Salman's novels are practically set to music. Martin can play. I think it might be a useful way of introducing different styles of ability.
You certainly describe Bob Dylan as a poet.
Bob Dylan's certainly a poet, yes. Yes.
But you have dabbled at least in some forms of verse, mainly dirty. Do you say you've got a good memory? Any limericks that spring to mind?
See, people expect filth at this point. The limerick
More filth is what they expect.
The limerick is a very capacious and elastic and subtle form. I would give you the example of the young engine driver named Hunt, who was given an engine to shunt, saw a runaway truck, by yelling out, "Duck," saved the life of the fellow in front. You see, I know what you wanted there. Whereas Robert Conquest, who is another member of this luncheon, he's now 94, he's born in 1917. A great historian, principally of the Russian Revolution, but of Stalinism. And the master, with Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis, of the limerick. And everyone here knows the speech from As You Like It, The Seven Ages of Man, Jacques' address on all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely peers. They have their exits and their entrances, and each man in his time plays many parts, these being 7 ages, right? You've got it in your head?
See, at the Opera House, you were doing Monty Python, so we're really stepping up.
I can do the Philosopher's Song too, if you want. Yeah. but so here's the 7 Ages of Man as done by Robert Conquest. 7 ages. First puking and mewling, then very pissed off with your schooling, then fucks and then fights, then judging chaps' rights, then sitting in slippers, then drooling.
Shakespeare was so damn verbose.
Jacques' delivery is 28 lines, and this is 5 short ones. And Conquest also did the history of the Russian Revolution in a limerick.
I don't suppose you can recall it, can you?
There once was a fellow named Lenin who did 2 or 3 million men in. That's a lot to have done in, but where he did 1 in, that old bastard Stalin did 10 in. And then Calvin's theory of predestination can be done in a limerick too.
And do you recall it?
There once was a man who said, "Damn, it is borne in upon me I am, a creature that moves in predestinate grooves. I'm not even a bus, I'm a tram." But just not to disappoint, there was a young hooker from Kew who filled up her pussy with glue and said, with a grin, "Since they'll pay to get in, they can pay to get out of it too." You see, that's what they wanted. Such a dead giveaway. Wasted the Shakespeare on them. Totally wasted.
Now, look, I hope at this point you'll afford me the courtesy that I think Isaiah Berlin afforded you of providing a polite answer to a question that you get asked all the time about the things that you didn't write about in the memoir. But I wanted to ask one thing that I haven't heard you asked about yet. You don't write much about your brother.
No.
Why not? Because, I mean, you've had a very public history.
Yes, and I thought that people can already read that if they want to. So I didn't want to go over old ground at all. And because since we were very small, we haven't lived in the same town or been in the same job or had very much contact.
Have you discussed that with him? Is he a bit miffed?
No, he's not miffed at all. I mean, I don't think he would particularly want to be in my book. I'm in his new book, which is actually a very interesting book just published called The Rage Against God, which is his defense of the Anglican religion against people like myself. And it has a long and actually rather beautiful, nostalgic account of a lost Christian England in the 50s when we were small. The cathedral close, the security and deference of Britain, something that he wishes could come back. And I don't miss particularly in that way at all. And I feature in that a bit.
We've talked about some of your great friendships. Obviously, in the changes of your political positions over the years, you've probably lost a few friends as well. Are there any that hurt to have lost?
Well, I should say first, I also made some very nice friends.
Sure. Paul Wolfowitz?
For example. Many handsome and beautiful and brave Iraqis and Kurds who I wouldn't have met if I hadn't been on their side in getting rid of the private ownership of their country by a psychopathic crime family. I prefer the new ones to the ones I lost in that respect. Thank you, by the way. It's quite rare and very restrained.
There's something of an expectation that there might be other people joining.
No, I don't think so. But it's nice to know there are some people who get that point. And I mean, look, Martin wrote a book about communism, which I thought was very bad and said was bad, and which misrepresented my opinions, I think unintentionally, but to me annoyingly. But I would never make a political disagreement a cause of a quarrel with a friend. I mean, I think it's silly to do that. But there's a tendency on the left, and I bet there are people here who know what I'm talking about, to think that if someone in any way disagrees with the left, it must be for the lowest possible reason. And that if you found the lowest possible motive, you found the right one. There's this whole culture of no one would leave us or quarrel with us if they weren't a sellout. It's actually a very sick mentality and very widespread. And people who think like that or feel like that can dump me if they want, but that's almost as much as to say that they weren't much of a friend. Anyway, I'll pull myself together and go out and find someone nice to be friends.
So who do you rate
Or
highest?
someone more principled, perhaps, or more courageous.
Okay, well, who do you rate highest of your new friends?
That would be telling.
I was asking.
Not telling you, sweetie. You wouldn't know their names, but I mean, they are people in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere who are on, I won't say on my side, who are on our side, on the side of civilization against barbarism and theocracy. They're worth knowing. It's been a wonderful thing in my life to find them and count them as friends. It's a matter of elementary internationalist, socialist solidarity to me. To be on their side and on the side of their long oppressed women folk. Actually, I will give you a couple of examples. It seems to me that the three most beautiful words in the secular language now are Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's become a great friend of mine, and who's that's better, and who has been through rape, genital mutilation, forced marriage to a relative or close relative, beaten, brutally treated, exiled, and so on, and who genuinely considers herself to be a lucky person because she's probably the only survivor of her class in Somalia who's still alive, and who witnesses for the most important thing of all in this combat, which is the rights of women, and the empowerment of women is the only cure we know to poverty and deprivation. And just being able to find myself a friend of hers and speak up for her and say a few words in her behalf is I tell you, is worth a lot of disapproving gazes from Michael Moore, say, who is, of course, also very beautiful in his own way.
You obviously, you know, your stance is on Islamofascism, which I think you claim to you've coined.
Well, not quite. I mean, when I wrote my reaction piece to 9/11, I said it's fascism with an Islamic face, which is a borrowing that some of the older comrades here will remember from what Alexander Dubček said about socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia, and what Susan Sontag said at a very famous meeting in solidarity with Poland in 1982, that the military dictatorship in Poland was fascism with a human face. But you can't say fascism with an Islamic face every single time. So, and anyway, not everyone's going to get the reference every single time. So it got a bit compressed into Islamofascism, which doesn't quite have the same resonance. But there we are. We need a word for it.
But you've written, as I say, very publicly, and everyone knows the kind of the changes or the perceived changes in your position on these things and supporting the war in Iraq. You've also written at great length and fantastically about the founding fathers, and in particular Jefferson. Does it trouble you that even if you obviously felt you're on the right side of the argument in relation to Iraq, that some of the ways in which that conflict has been prosecuted, and in particular long-term detention without trial, that in fact you can be on the right side of an argument but still potentially fundamentally undermine the values which define a nation?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I remember going to Abu Ghraib not long after the liberation of Baghdad, and where I divide people, by the way, between those who knew about Abu Ghraib before 2003 and those who walk around as if it was a prison opened by the United States for its own purposes after 2003. If you didn't know about Abu Ghraib before 2003, be very modest in what you say about it. But it was a place where at one point it was an industrial execution shed and torture chamber where hundreds of people were hanged every day, often from the same beam at the same time. And where, when it became overcrowded and the numbers needed to be culled, the guards would go out with the list of names around Baghdad and go to the families and say, we can keep your son off the list for execution if you give us 1,000 dinars and so on. Impossible to deepen the night, the sort of the pornographic element of the Saddam Hussein regime. And the smell of the place when it was broken open is with me still. And I remember saying to the people I was with, don't use this anymore. Don't try and convert it into a prison. This place needs fire from heaven. It should just be blown up, and salt should be sown in the ruins. Don't try and use it. It's evil. I actually think evil is a word you have to use. You can't do without it. And evil has a particular stench, and I can personally claim to have smelled it, winded it, scented it. Anyway, no one listens to me. I often think that's, a lot of what's wrong. And they ignored me. And the place did become a nightmare. Nothing like on the same scale. I won't even have that suggested. Prison conditions in Iraq have vastly improved since the arrival of the coalition forces. Anyone who doesn't know that is a fool. But recreational torture on video makes people. And I wrote and I said and I believe that it didn't change my attitude towards torture. I mean, I've been waterboarded because I wanted to find out what it was like. I thought the main contribution I could make was to see, well, is this torture or not? Yes, it is. Didn't change my attitude towards torture. It very nearly changed my attitude towards capital punishment. I thought the people who did that in Abu Ghraib should have been taken out and shot. I would have protested against it eventually if they were put up against the wall, but I wouldn't have had my heart completely in it. It would have been nice to have them shot out of hand. Well, a brief and fair trial, but then shot out of hand.
So how long did you last in the waterboarding? I've seen the footage, but
no, you have. Well, not very long the first time, because everything in you reacts to the sensation of being drowned. By the way, you read in the newspapers, it mimics the sensation of being drowned. It's not at all that. You are being drowned, except slowly. So your whole body goes into a spasm of resistance to this, and time has no meaning at all. But when I looked at the clock, I thought, Jesus, no son of Commander Hitchens should have wimped out as fast as that. So I asked them to do it again. I lasted a few more seconds, but the point was pretty easily made by then. And for quite a long time afterwards, I shouldn't say post-traumatic stress disorder, because many honorable warriors who've been through much worse than that have had that, but I did have very bad nightmares, which I never have nightmares, and I kept all the time thinking that I was being choked and was drowning. It didn't go away for quite a long time.
So that's waterboarding. How do you think you'd go with whiskey boarding?
Well, the guy goes into a bar, says, "I'd like a glass of James Walker, please." Barman says, "You mean Johnny, don't you?" It's not when you know him as well as I do. People are constantly surprised by this, but I can actually take a drink and manage it, handle it, carry on apparently ambulant.
I think it's actually one of the stronger arguments against atheism. I believe your liver is a miracle.
People come from far and wide, yeah. I have some advice for boozers in my book. I mean, the thing is, don't mix, very important. Try not to drink on an empty stomach, drink plenty of water, dance with the one that brung you, all that kind of thing. And don't use it to cure the blues, for example. That would
Do you
be
speak from experience there?
No, except indirect. My father was someone who was a pessimist and would, in a morose way, drink, and it would only make him more morose. Whereas I'm, Evelyn Waugh says about Charles Ryder, or Charles Ryder says of himself, rather, in Brideshead Revisited, that he drank for love of the moment and to prolong and to enhance it. And that's what I do. If the dinner party's going well, I want it to go on longer and louder, and for my own part in it to be more prominent and so forth. But if you drank because you had the blues, you'd be in big trouble. And then never say that I don't remember last night, because you do. Some hostesses will accept this excuse, but they shouldn't. Or rather, if you really don't remember, then you're in terrible trouble.
And has that happened to you often?
No, I have no amnesia at all. To a quote from the same novel, when Anthony Blanche says, "I left school under a cloud," and he pauses and said, "Why do they call it that? It seems to me like a shaft of the most unwelcome light." No, if I was embarrassing to anyone, or for any reason, which I don't necessarily confess that I was or am the night before, the problem would be you'd remember it only too well. So I don't think it should be a socially acceptable excuse.
Well, look, as with all Hitchens conversations, we could go for hours, even just to exhaust the
I'm not going anywhere.
the heart puns and the limericks. But I thought we might open it up now to you guys who've come along this evening. There are several microphones through the hall. Interestingly, I think there are 4, but they're numbered 2 through 5, which I assume means that's number 1. But if you would like to ask Christopher a question, please do come up to the microphones. We've got 2 here, 3 here. I don't know where 4 is. Where's 4? Just there. And you're most welcome to pose a question. Keep it relatively brief, or else I'll Tony Jones you and take it as a comment. So we'll start over at number 2 here. You, sir.
With greatest respect, Hitch, given that you're being very reflective about your own life and your experiences, I was wondering if you had a few comments about Eric Prince, if you know the man that I'm talking about when I say that.
The artist formerly known.
No. No, that would be the CEO of Z, now Blackwater, now Z, with his own Christian dominionist take on the war on terror. And I was wondering if you'd read Jeremy Scahill's book when considering your position on...
I have to say it's gone past my bat. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, that was a good start. Excellent. We might go to microphone number 5. Thank you.
Being in a hopeless position when being waterboarded, would you think twice about God being great or not?
I didn't get that.
I didn't. Sorry, could you ask that again?
Could you give it some welly?
Yeah, I heard being in a hopeless position of being waterboarded. Could you?
Would you think twice about God being great or not?
Didn't get it.
Sorry,
As Dudley Moore used to say, can't hear a blind word you say.
Yeah. So, would you think twice about God being great or not?
What was the preface to that?
Having been waterboarded.
Yeah. I collect non sequiturs as well, by the way. Of which that's a real peach, I've got to tell you. It's going in the next.
Well, we're going to get through a lot of questions tonight, ladies and gentlemen. That's one of the upsides. Let's say that. Let's try.
Bring it on. For fuck's sake.
Let's try microphone number 4.
Yeah, a question I wanted to ask the panel of which you were part earlier today, but I didn't get time. By way of illustration, you've said once before that it is a cultural achievement that we no longer use a certain 6-letter word starting with N, and in the context of needing to be on our guard against self-censorship with vague language for the sake of things like political correctness, how do we identify them?
Right. I think I got at least the first half of it. It's a basically, you're resuming an earlier session in the Writers' Festival to begin with, but you say it's a cultural achievement not to use a 6-letter word starting with M.
N.
N, right, okay, well that does prove how difficult it is to hear up here.
Sorry.
Could you repeat the second half of the question? This is
hell.
just going to go fantastically.
Why don't you
Yeah.
take it back?
Yes.
Tell them all to sit down.
That's right. Look, we'll try a female voice.
It was nicer with.
How about that?
Didn't you think it was nicer when it was just the two of us?
I was having a ball. We'll try one down here.
Regret going to a female voice.
What?
No, Christopher, I'm a great admirer of your work.
Thank you.
Particularly your views on atheism.
Yes.
Which people of my generation particularly can ascribe to. But you wrote an article I'd like to take issue with in Vanity Fair, perhaps maybe 3 years ago. It was a brief article where you claimed that women were not funny.
Yeah.
I've had many discussions about this article with my friends, and I suppose I'd like you to talk to that, because the way I can sort of rebut that is, I know that you're a lover of literature, and I look at women like George Eliot and Jane Austen, and I think that how do we define a word like funny, and who owns the interpretation of that? Because, you know, in drawing rooms and in
I think we've got
Hitchens and okay, you've got the gist. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like you to talk to that, if you would.
You get it?
I got some of that.
Not.
Seemed to be some shrill, humorless bitch. The thing is this, and she began very sweetly by saying that atheism was an important principle, which it is, and I'll just say this about that. One of the threads of my book is the struggle to find a position that's consistently anti-totalitarian. I think that's a responsibility everybody has, whatever their other politics are. And the original form of dictatorship, as George Orwell points out, is theocratic. The first declaration of independence you have to make before you can assail the totalitarian position is to say that there can be no celestially imposed, unalterable dictatorship. That's the most sinister kind of war. Now, to the lady's point. Some people think that by asking the question why women aren't funny, which, by the way, is making the assumption that they're not, that I mean that there are no female comedians or wits. Not so. But you will notice of Roseanne Barr and Sarah Silverman Say, for example, both of whom wrote to me saying they thought I was right about this, that the female comedian is either a dyke or a Jew. Or in some other way, a man. And they're funny to precisely that extent. And that there are biological and evolutionary reasons why this should be so. If you, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you, if you tonight are talking to a friend who says, if it's a she, I've just found a great new chap, it's a moral certainty that she'll say, and he really makes me laugh. You've heard it, haven't you? When did you last hear a guy saying, I've found a really precious new squeeze, and then he'll say a couple of other things that I'm not going to share with you. And he's not going to say, and she keeps me in stitches. Or if he does...
Does that say something about women or the priorities of men?
No, it's both, because women don't need to be funny. They can be if they want, but they have no need to be in order to make themselves attractive. They are, to men, if you follow me, already attractive. Whereas for most men, what are their chances of getting laid if they're not funny? It's all we've got, darling, and we cherish it. Okay?
But I must say, I think there's an interesting point that arises in your memoir, follows from that question, and in particular your answer to it. It did strike me in the book that...
Oh, we're back.
Sorry, yes, yeah, for sure.
Did you miss me?
It was terrible. It was far cleaner in the masses. It did strike me that you seem to write, I think, quite viciously about women often. And I think you seem to be far less generous.
Well, tell me what I was vicious about.
You refer to the incident of visiting the prostitute with Martin Amis, where you describe her as I'm trying to remember the adjective you use, but it's the something bitch. Avaricious bitch.
Avaricious
That's
bitch.
right.
Well,
yeah.
She was a greedy little minx. Yeah.
Well, without
you could see it in her eyes.
Without citing chapter and verse.
And she did have, I add, she had one of the most evil faces I've ever seen on a human being.
Well,
she was...
You're somewhat affirming the premise of my question as we proceed.
She was bewitching, in other words. But there, I mean, I have a duty to verisimilitude. I mean, that was the case with that terrible cat house on Lexington Avenue.
But you write
the most sordid morning I've ever spent in my life.
Sure. You write affectionately about your mother, about very few other women, and
Mrs. Thatcher.
And indeed affectionately there too. But
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, well, as I've already...
Not your wives.
Azar Nafizi, author, a great friend of mine, author of the unbelievably brilliant, beautiful book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which if you haven't read, you should. He was a tremendous defender of the rights of the downtrodden and raped and dispossessed women of Iran. But no, I'm sorry to say this girl in the Happy Isles knocking shop was a real, woof, boy. Even now, I can think of it. But it was the greatest, that outing with Martin to the handjob parlor was the best example I can think of turning lead into gold, because it was fantastically sordid and nasty and depressing expedition he made me come on, field work, he said, for his novel, Likely Story, where this girl tried to keep on bidding me up all the time. Every time I agreed to a price, she'd raise it. As I say in my report of it, the price was the only thing in the room that showed any sign of enlarging itself. But when I would later read the relevant chapter of Martin's novel Money, I realized it was all fine. That these girls didn't know it, these avaricious minxes, but they were in the service of literature that day. And they've written an imperishable page.
all right, we'll go back to them, shall we? We'll just give it one more go. We're going to try microphone number 3.
Can I just...
Ironically, we could hear that for the first time. But,
and I just wanted to know how that support started and whether or not...
It was the question's in relation to Iraq.
How did your support for the war in Iraq begin? And do you now consider the war that you've supported a success?
Okay. A theme of my book, which I had thought at one point of calling Both Sides Now, is the operations of the dialectic and the way I could, as it operates in society and internationally and in the economy and so on, and also in my own cortex. So the one reason why I supported intervention in Iraq was because of my long history of opposition to it. I've been going to Iraq since the mid-1970s, since just before the time, in fact, when Saddam Hussein managed to get all power in his own hands. And I'd seen the steady evolution of the country into a one-man show run by a psychopathic crime family, as I've already said, with aggressive designs on its neighbors, committing genocide within its own borders, using weapons of mass destruction both inside and outside its borders, and borrowing from the worst of both fascism and Stalinism in its ideology. And I realized that the anti-war position, the position of containment of this regime, was based on a false premise, which was that this psycho leader understood self-preservation and understood deterrence and containment and sanctions and so forth. That's absolutely not true. Whenever he can, he makes the most insane possible decision. And this is very terrifying. It's not unlike the dealings we're currently having with both North Korea and Iran. You cannot be certain, indeed you have every reason to doubt, that unlike as with, say, the Soviet communists, that these people have any concept of rational self-interest. They may even indeed be suicidal. So there's no possibility of relaxation while they're around. You can't sleep, and there's no possibility of coexistence. Ultimately, I believe our civilization's existence is incompatible with neurotic expansionists, latently and blatantly aggressive, xenophobic and theocratic regimes. So, and I give a whole chapter to showing exactly how my mind changed. It's not about what I think, it's about how I think, which I hope is more interesting. And if you buy it, I'll sign it. And as for now, well, in 2003, Saddam Hussein organized a referendum in his own favor. in which for the first time in Iraq, and I think in the first time in recorded history, a turnout of 100% was claimed, as well as a recorded vote for the only candidate named. Never been done before, with people forced to jump up and down, ululating and cutting their wrists to write their ballot papers in blood and shouting for jihad and martyrdom and self-sacrifice. Unbelievably horrifying business, presided over by the dictator and his two sons, the voluptuously sadistic and deranged Uday and Qusay, whose succession was the thing we'd be living through now if we'd allowed the chance to occur. Now, the president of Iraq is Jalal Talabani, who I met when he was the leader of a gassed and murdered and dispersed Kurdish people, the guerrilla socialist leader in the mountains in 1991, the first ever elected president of Iraq. His party is the corresponding party of the Socialist International. His people, the Kurds, have an autonomous zone protected and self-governing in the northeastern provinces of the country. There's a written constitution, there's a parliament, there's a court of appeal, a free press, regular elections. I know a lot of people think that it would have been better if we'd left Saddam Hussein alone, but I can't be of that party. I'm terribly sorry. I think this is an improvement.
For your answer.
You make the case passionately for the invasion of Iraq. What
intervention?
Intervention in Iraq. Liberation, sure. What do you not think that it should follow that America should intervene in all situations where the values of liberal democracies are being undermined? Or what's the tipping point for you?
Well, first, the United States and its coalition allies are in Iraq still under a United Nations mandate to reconstruct the country. So it's not a unilateral intervention, and in my opinion, there was no need for a second resolution for the intervention after the Security Council had voted 9-0 to say that Saddam Hussein must either come into compliance or face grave consequences, and the certainty is he never came into compliance. Iraq is now in compliance with the resolutions on weapons of mass destruction and has been inspected and now can be said to be free of them, but it couldn't have been said to be that before unless you're willing to take on trust Saddam's regime itself, which I wouldn't recommend. I don't think after its record it was entitled to the smallest scintilla of the presumption of innocence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what do you have to do if you're a state to sacrifice your sovereignty? How far do you have to go? Well, there are 4 possible conditions. One is you invade and occupy the territory of neighboring countries. The second is if you violate the Genocide Convention, which mandates, by the way, if it's broken, it mandates action by all its signatory powers. If you can't, either to prevent or if you can't prevent, to punish the genocide. The third is fooling around with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and trying to acquire illegal or use illegal weapons of mass destruction. And the fourth is giving aid and comfort to international terrorist organizations as designated. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, multiply guilty on all 4 fronts several times. And its sovereignty gone. It was under a UN-imposed sanctions regime. Most of its airspace was patrolled by foreign aircraft to protect its people from a renewal of genocide. It was a matter of how long it could stay half slave and half free. I think that question was resolved the right way. Now, I don't know of any other regime that qualifies to have lost its sovereignty in quite that way. Robert Mugabe did send some mad troops into the crazy war in the Congo, but you can't say he invaded or occupied a neighboring country. He doesn't have any weapons of mass destruction. He doesn't give sanction and cover to international terrorist groups. And even though his policy of food denial to areas of the country that don't support him is certainly criminal, I don't know if it would quite raise to the level of the Genocide Convention.
And would you make the same argument about North Korea?
North Korea is openly in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Not that it's ever signed it, but I mean, in the principles of same, its starvation of its people to a point where they're 6 inches shorter than South Koreans. That's a lot of starving. Starving and stunting people down to that extent is a terrifying commitment to keeping your people hungry And it's a good question as to whether you can commit genocide against your own people. I certainly think it's worth discussing. Undoubtedly supports international terrorists and gangster groups, without any question, as it does narcotics smuggling, currency forgery, and all manner of other outlaw things. I think that certainly there's an absolute case for removing the Kim Jong-il regime, but we are subject to its nuclear blackmail. We are as much hostages to it as its starving slaves are. But on principle, of course, yes. They're looking for a war with us, and they will probably, I think, have one. I think we should pick the time and the place of it and not them. Totalitarian regimes are incompatible with our existence. That will be found out however much we wish it wasn't true, it is true. It will be discovered. It will be forced upon us, that awareness, if we don't develop it for ourselves.
I won't pursue that. I'll give the microphone number 2 the chance to ask a question. Fun though discussing Iraq is. You can't turn it into a filthy limerick, can you, Christopher? So, number 2.
It's a question on American domestic politics. Would you explain why it seems to me that the less well-off Americans on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, a significant percentage of them seem to resent some of the bills which Obama is trying to pass, which would apparently do them the most use? Perhaps the health bill, perhaps the financial services bill. They seem to resent it in a way that you might not expect.
Did you catch the question?
Yeah, I did. There is among a lot of Americans, including those who don't have any property and don't have any security of employment or income, there is a powerful resistance to state influence. It comes, I think, partly from the frontier. It comes in part from a sort of Calvinism that's quite strong among old pioneers. Has been handed down. It comes also, of course, as a legacy of the Civil War. But there are many people who would say, if you let me keep my gun and you stay out of my church, I don't want any more help from you, thanks. I'd rather live as if the government wasn't there. That's the point of being an American. I don't want to hear from Washington. It's my right to live in this part of Kansas unmolested. This is paradoxically very beautifully expressed by a Tea Party rally, a placard that I'm sure some of you saw recently saying, keep the government's cotton-picking hands off my Medicare. Because they've forgotten where Medicare came from. They thought it was a right that they had to defend from Washington.
It's not one of Jefferson's, I don't think.
I think Mr. Jefferson would have had a slightly finer line on a thing like that. But that is the mentality, and that's also, of course, the irony of it. I deep down think Americans don't really want health care. They certainly don't want it if they have to pay for anyone else to have it. They think life should be risky. They think you should be taking your chances. They look down on countries where the government tries to make sure that everyone's life works out.
So what do you make of the Tea Party movement, and are you concerned by the tenor of the kind of groundswell of American politics at the moment? Do you think it's dangerous?
Well, my new line on this, which I've tried out on a few people already, is the Tea Party movement proves that all politics is yokel. I went to one of their big rallies on Capitol Hill the other day. I took my daughter, and in front of me there was standing in front of us there was standing a guy who said, "We didn't bring our guns," and then on the other side said, "This time." And then one said, I'm defending the First Amendment today, but I'll be defending the Second Amendment tomorrow. And that's the gun amendment. And I thought, ooh, I'm really scared now. It seemed pathetic to me, actually. There was a note of desperation to it and pathos, I thought. These are people who, in part, they don't recognize the country they used to grow up in. Small town, church, monochrome. They feel it changing, they feel powerless to affect it, but they're absolutely powerless to change it back. It's not going to change back. There's something plaintive about it. And of course they are, I don't want to sound like a snob, Oh, what the hell?
It's a bit late.
A lot of them are saps, is what I have to say. I mean, anyone who thinks that Sarah Palin isn't just cashing out on this and is going to make a few $1 million on her book and then leave them flat is a fool. She's obviously, classically, hollow, heartless opportunist, the shallowest kind. And she's going to leave them in the lurch once she's cashed out. And she seems to be the one who is their Pasionaria, or their Joan of Arc. Well, this is no good.
That was about...
Were you yawning?
Not at all. No. I was segueing.
I thought you were stifling something. How am I supposed to feel?
No, we were talking...
Are we boring you? No.
I thought we might move from American domestic politics to British politics, and I thought I'd begin by asking you to compare the current Tory Prime Minister to a former Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and perhaps you can tell us your view of the two of them.
I don't know anything about Mr. Cameron, and I shouldn't pretend that I do. Anyone who wants an illuminating discussion about British politics this month shouldn't be asking me, sorry.
All right.
I'd like to assure you of this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, where I don't know what I'm talking about, I try and shut the hell up. I can tell you about having a physical encounter with Mrs. Thatcher.
Well, that's where I thought we might lead to, just to kind of round things up. We could finish on Iraq, but I thought...
That would be dragging things back to my memoirs, but that's what I'm here for.
Well, so one of the women you do talk about sexually,
yes,
is Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you convince us that it's anything other than a ooh?
I went to see her speak just as she'd become the leader of the opposition. It must have been 78 or 77, I suppose. And everyone, you can look it up, everyone in the press in those days, the Tory press too, which was still pro-Edward Heath, was saying, this is a spasm on the part of the Tories. This is a shrill suburban housewife, unelectably right-wing, ignorant, provincial, and so on. It's amazing to go back and look at this. I don't think this is true at all. I've just seen her speak to the party conference. She's got some of the most perfect skin I've almost ever seen on a human being. Unbelievably lovely eyes, and a roll of the hip that would,
But would it?
Yeah. And so I wrote this in the New Statesman, saying I thought she had a sexual hold on her party. Now, I've had a lot of rough mail in my life. The worst, how could you possibly mail I've ever had was about that. But I thought, no, I'm sure I'm right. And so I went to a reception in the House of Lords where I knew she was going to be, thinking, I'm going to follow up on this. And we were introduced by Peregrine Worsthorne. And I thought she recognized the name, because I think if you're the leader of the Tory party and a young man, then rather a handsome young mammal, working for the leading socialist opposition paper, says he thinks you're sexy, it's possible you remember his name. Anyway, it seemed to me that she did. So we got into a fight about Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, where I was right on the point of fact and she was wrong, but where she stuck up for her position so well that in the end I thought, it's not that big a point. I said, well, no doubt there's much in what you say, ma'am, and I bowed as if to acknowledge that we could move on. And she said, no, bow lower. And I felt all volition leaving me. And I bowed further and straightened up again, began to say, no, much lower. Till I was bent right over, and she'd been rolling up the order of the day, the parliamentary order paper, behind her back into a tube, stepped round behind me, smacked me on the bum. And I regained the vertical with some difficulty. And she walked away, and over her shoulder said, naughty boy. I thought I was going to come in my pants. Anyway, as I trudged back home over Westminster Bridge, I thought, this woman has really got something. She's got real charisma, and, well, you laugh. But every single male opponent of hers in the old Tory establishment was within a couple of years completely taken off a chessboard and put back in the box without compunction, and on their part, without resistance. They could do nothing to stop. She magnetized them, she hypnotized them, she had them under her spell, and I think I was very lucky to get an early glimpse of this, and it's in my book, and if you buy it, I'll sign it.
Did you meet her many times other than that?
Occasionally, a car would draw up with no license plates outside my apartment.
And you assumed the position.
And the curtains drawn, and a chauffeur would... But it doesn't do to bandy a lady's name too much.
We have time for one more question. I do apologise to those who've been waiting at the microphones, but I will go to microphone 3.
No, if you have, but if you had to give up one, which passport would it be, the British or the American?
If you had to give up one passport, which would it be?
That's a waste of a question.
Pass, okay, well. I'll take your lead on that one. Question...
Anglo-American.
Anglo-American? All of the above. We'll take question number 2 then.
Come on, comrades.
One cracker to finish us off.
Yeah, the other night on, I think it was ABC Radio, you commented on your distaste at seeing the David Campbell scandal on the front of the paper rather than the situation in North Korea. I was just wondering if you could comment on the evolution or the generation of journalism you've seen throughout your career. Nothing?
Nothing.
All right, well, unfortunately...
Have you got one?
Well, yeah, I would like you to give us one and your dirtiest limerick to conclude, if possible.
They tend to be clerical, the really dirty ones. There was a young fellow of kings whose mind was upon higher things, but his real desire was a boy in the choir with an ass like a jelly on springs. That's not very dirty, though, but it gives you an idea. It's a curtain raiser for the anti-clerical. The Bishop of Central Japan used to roger himself with a fan. And when taxed with these acts, he replied, "It contracts and expands, rather more than a man." But you see, you can do it with almost no dirty words. That's the key thing, I think, is to keep it filthy but not smutty. A vice both obscene and unsavory holds the Bishop of Barking in slavery. With lascivious howls he deflowers young owls that he lures to an underground aviary. And, okay, you want one dirty one, then. Because these are suggestive, shall we say, but not it is said of the Bishop of Birmingham that he fucks little boys while confirming them. They kneel on their hassock, he lifts up his cassock and pumps his episcopal sperm in them. That's quite dirty.
And on that note...
but very contemporary, I think.
Indeed,
very
indeed.
As the new Elton John song for the Vatican now goes, "Don't let your son go down on me."
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's absolutely no doubt that Australia loves Christopher Hitchens. It's wonderful to have you here.
Love him back.
Hitch 22 is the book. It will be signed in the foyer afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Thank you very much. Great fun.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.